Hello there everyone, welcome to the channel if you're new, welcome back if you aren't. I am EDJ, and boy, what an adventure we have been through. And at the moment, this is the final episode of this series, the conclusion of the many civil wars, the rise of Caesar, and finally the death of the Republic, and the rise of the Empire. So, I'm very happy that we've made it this far. And by the time this video comes out, it will be about December-ish, because I have stuck with the once a week release. Though at the moment, this is about May 24th, so it goes to show you, I binged this in like a single week, like 7 to 10 episodes a day. Like I was real wilding on this one, and this was just, I couldn't get enough with it. It was a masterpiece, in my opinion. This might be one of the greatest series of history on YouTube, and I loved every minute of it. And if we're not done yet, we've got to wrap this up, but I'll save my praises a little bit after, but you know where I'm getting at. If you guys want to watch this original video, the link is always down in the description. With that said, let us wrap up this masterpiece of a series. Without any further ado, by kings and generals, let us watch the Battle of Alexandria, the end of Antony and Cleopatra.
13 years have passed since Caesar's assassination.
Dang.
An on-again, off-again civil war continued to rock the Roman world during these years. And then, only two remained. Despite initial equality in forces, the Actium campaign resulted in a huge and decisive victory for Octavian and Agrippa. Nevertheless, the war was not yet over. Antony and Cleopatra had survived the battle, and so long as Antony was alive, Octavian would not be able to claim victory. One final push into Egypt would be needed, where Antony and Cleopatra would make their last stand. The final war of the Roman Republic was about to reach its conclusion at Alexandria. This video is made available for free thanks in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Actium in September of 31 BC. Two-thirds of Antony's fleet was either captured or destroyed, but his army was still in the field. Antony's orders were for them to march to Macedonia and then cross back into Asia Minor. Antony himself, however, would not lead them, a testament to how slim he considered their chances of success. Octavian and Agrippa's own army shadowed Antony's 19 legions, all of whom were by now weakened by disease and lack of resources. Not fit to do battle, the legions made a deal with Octavian, the entirety of the army surrendering to him without a fight.
Dang.
In exchange, Octavian spared all of the rank and file, and many of the equites and senators who had sided with Antony.
Dude,
there were some, however,
that is insane. Like, wow. 19 whole legions. Like, that's a diplomatic, victory there, right? Like, hey, they all joined me, no bloodshed. You kidding me? That's amazing. You could easily make a lot of propaganda off of that, Octavian.
who were too politically dangerous to be kept alive. Chief among them Canidius, the overall commander of the army, and Cassius Parmensis, one of the last two surviving assassins of Caesar,
Wow.
and Gaius Scribonius Curio. This last figure was the son of the Curio who had once served as one of Caesar's commanders in North Africa, and more importantly, of Fulvia, the ex-wife of Antony. Fulvia had proven to be a fierce supporter of Antony, helping to wage war in Italy on his behalf, and Octavian was not taking any chances that her son might follow her example. The mass surrender of the army did result in some significant problems for Octavian, however. Firstly was the large amount of allied eastern rulers who had now fallen into Octavian's purview. Many of these, particularly the more insignificant ones, were deposed and replaced, while the more powerful kings, such as Amnitus of Galatia and Archelaus of Cappadocia, were allowed to remain in power. Octavian was sending a clear message that the East now had a new master, while avoiding too much destabilization in the region. The second and perhaps even more important problem was that Octavian now had tens of thousands of men that needed food, water, and just as importantly, payment. At least 4 of the legions were retained, but the rest, approximately 60,000 men, were disbanded and sent back to Italy. Octavian had for years been strapped for cash, and having failed to take the treasury of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, he could do little more than make promises of payments to these troops. He was well aware that this would eventually be a problem, and so Agrippa was sent to Italy, along with the veterans, to try and keep things under control for as long as possible. Agrippa, along with another of Octavian's close friends, Maecenas, were both given copies of Octavian's signet ring, allowing them to conduct official business on his behalf. With much of the hard fighting already done, Octavian probably left these two to maintain affairs in Italy, while he finished up operations in the east, ensuring that he would be able to take credit for the final defeat of Antony.
Yeah, it was me, guys. It wasn't Agrippa. It was me. You know, he's telling. And Agrippa's such a homie. He's like, all right, Augustus, I'll let you say that. Why not, bro? I'm just happy to help. Agrippa's a true bro, man. Like, are you kidding me? If he had been any more, like, prideful or like, treacherous, like, he could have easily been like, oh, he's insulted me, he slighted me, I'll just take power for myself. And then, if Agrippa goes rogue, I can't imagine anyone else stopping him, so... Like I said, Agrippa, true homie, bro.
Agrippa and Maecenas had been given an impossible task, however. Shortly after the veterans' arrival in Italy, there were rumblings of mutiny. Agrippa, for all his popularity and success, was not the man who had made promises to the soldiers, and so they were forced to call Octavian back to Italy personally to handle the matter. Sailing in the midst of winter from Asia Minor to Brundisium, Octavian and his small escort fleet were caught in a tempest, sinking some of the ships. By pure luck, Octavian was on one of the ships that survived, with only its rigging and rudder destroyed, and he made it to Brundisium a couple of days later. Octavian was reportedly met by almost the entire Senate, as well as thousands of equites, all keen to show their fealty. There were also thousands of the mutinous veterans. Octavian met with them and reaffirmed his promise of payment, as well as giving orders to parcel out various pieces of land to them. Communities in Italy that had supported Antony were displaced and moved outside the peninsula, with the veterans given their lands instead. Moreover, Octavian also went so far as to put up his own property for auction to help raise funds. Whether or not anyone had the courage to actually buy anything from him is not recorded, but the gesture served its purpose, and the veterans were, for now, pacified. This was only temporary, however, and Octavian was now against the clock. He needed to take Egypt and the vast treasury hoarded there, or else face mass mutinies in Italy, which could be disastrous for his ambitions. Antony and Cleopatra would not, however, make this an easy task for him. In the immediate aftermath of Actium, Antony had gone to Peritonium in North Africa to secure command of 4 legions he had previously posted there, while Cleopatra returned to Alexandria. Upon her arrival, Cleopatra immediately began gathering as much wealth from Egypt as possible, including stripping temples and bringing it all to her mausoleum in Alexandria, whilst simultaneously sending out envoys, desperately looking for allies. Antony, meanwhile, sent messengers to the legions at Peritonium under the command of Lucius Pinarius Scarpus, who had served as legate under Antony during the Philippi campaign and had minted coins on his behalf, hailing Antony as Imperator. He was also a nephew of Caesar's, however, and thereby a cousin of Octavian. Evidently, word had reached Scarpus of his cousin's victory at Actium, and so when Antony's delegates arrived, requesting he hand over command of the legions, Scarpus had them executed, along with those in his staff who disagreed with the decision.
Wow.
When Antony appeared in person to take command, Scarpus simply refused to allow him in, forcing Antony to give up the endeavour. Scarpus would be well rewarded for his betrayal, Octavian later appointing him as governor of Cyrenaica.
Dang. Yeah, you're just seeing everything fall apart for Antony, man.
For Antony, on the other hand, it was one of his lowest moments. A year ago, he had been one of the most powerful men in the world, capable of mustering hundreds of thousands of men and rallying dozens of kings to his banner. Now he was unable to take command of just 4 legions, and was humiliated by an old friend and subordinate. According to Plutarch, Antony was so depressed by the state of affairs that he tried to kill himself, but was prevented from doing so by some of the few friends he had left with him and returned to Alexandria. Whether Plutarch's claim is true or not is hard to say. Plutarch certainly dedicated a significant amount of time talking about Antony's depression, including a report that Antony built himself a secluded pier on Pharos Island where he lived in solitude, emulating the misanthropic Timon of Athens, but some of these claims appear almost too far-fetched to be believed. If Antony did do such things, then it is possible, as American historian Barry Strauss suggests, that it was not an act of desperation, but instead propaganda by Antony to highlight how many friends had betrayed him, and to try and shame them. Whichever the case may be, Antony was by no means giving up. Both he and Cleopatra still had cards left to play. They built up what forces they could, including enrolling 2 of their sons into the junior ranks of the army, hoping to bolster support, and the ships that had survived Actium were prepared to continue the war at sea. The 2 also had contingency plans, one of which was to sail to Hispania and stir up dissent there, as the sons of Pompey had decades earlier. Another of which was to build a fleet in the Arabian Gulf, which would provide a route to Egyptian allies in India if needed. This ambitious plan was thwarted, however, by Arab tribes from Petra, who burnt the fleet on the instigation of Octavian's governor in Syria. Nevertheless, the couple kept looking for angles. Numerous
Dang, dude. Just like everything has... It's so weird to have seen Mark Antony, just under Julius Caesar. He rose so far, and he reached like the peak. Before the Battle of Actium, he had reached the peak of like power, and then just how it's just fallen apart for him so quickly. It's almost tragic. Like, it really does make sense that it lends itself to Shakespeare's plays, because, yeah, this just plays out completely very tragic, and, yeah, but hey, he's still Roman, he's still trying to fight, but yeah, the writing's on the wall, right? Just completely, it's done.
Tribes and assassins were sent to Octavian, none of which succeeded, but that kept him occupied and slowed him down. Moreover, envoys were sent to Octavian from Antony and Cleopatra together and from both separately. Behind Antony's back, Cleopatra supposedly sent Octavian a crown and scepter, effectively offering to become a vassal in exchange for her and her family's safety. Octavian accepted the gifts and publicly proclaimed that if Cleopatra abandoned her armies and kingdom, he would consider sparing her. In private, however, he made a separate offer. Cleopatra would be spared and allowed to stay a vassal monarch if she killed Antony. The latter, for his part, gave up the last of Caesar's assassins, Turullius, who had taken refuge with him, and offered to live in exile as a private citizen in Athens. Octavian promptly had Turullius executed and ignored Antony's other offers. Dio even claims that Antony offered to kill himself in exchange for Cleopatra and their children's safety, but it is hard to say how accurate this is. For Octavian's part, he still needed to tread carefully. The wealth of Egypt was gathered in Alexandria under Cleopatra's watchful eye, and he could not risk her fleeing with it, or worse, destroying it entirely. As such, Octavian was cautious to always respond to Cleopatra's appeals with various offers of clemency, and some sources claim even went so far as to send messengers saying that he was in love with Cleopatra. He would need to ensure that Cleopatra always had hope, up until the moment that he could seize control of the treasury. Plutarch paints a tragic view of the mood in Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra disbanded their social group of so-called inimitable livers and replaced it with the Society of Partners in Death. All too aware of the approach of Octavian's armies, the couple and their friends partied late into the nights, each one presumably counting the days until Octavian's arrival. Meanwhile, Cleopatra began testing numerous poisons to find the ones that acted the fastest and were the least painful. Plutarch should be taken with a pinch of salt, but it is likely that his writings did reflect a genuine feel at the time. Everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before Octavian's forces arrived, and then it would be a matter of choosing to die on the battlefield or by their own hand. By now, Octavian was ready. To the west of Egypt, he sent Cornelius Gallus to take over command of Scarpus's 4 legions, while he marched a separate force of tens of thousands through Syria, planning to attack Egypt from 2 sides. Antony, in turn, marched his army with naval support to Gallus. Once again, he tried to appeal to the legions to rejoin him, but Gallus drowned out his appeals with a fanfare of trumpets. Frustrated, Antony attempted an attack from both land and sea, but he was quickly repulsed. In all likelihood, Antony's force was smaller than that of Gallus, and the attack was one of near desperation. In any case, Antony was forced to return to Alexandria empty-handed. Meanwhile, in the east, Octavian's forces had taken the stronghold of Pelusium, an important strategic strongpoint that Antony had banked on securing his eastern flank. While some sources do say that Octavian took it by force, others say that it was handed over by agents of Cleopatra to try and ingratiate herself with him. Whatever the case may be, Octavian was able to advance quickly and reached the outskirts of Alexandria just 10 days later in the summer of 30 BC. As at Actium, Antony tried his best to keep searching for new angles to victory. He led his cavalry out of the city in an audacious sally against Octavian's cavalry that were still exhausted from their march, routing them and chasing them back to Octavian's camp. Ultimately though, it was of little consequence, save for a boost to morale. Antony even went so far as to challenge Octavian to single combat, an offer that Octavian answered, saying that Antony had many ways to die. By this point, Antony had exhausted his options. Diplomacy and espionage had failed, the escape plan to India had been foiled, and he had been unable to amass more legions to his side, and the chances of him defeating Octavian in the field were slim to none. Nonetheless, Antony steeled himself for battle one final time and marched out of the city with what was left of his army and navy. In all probability, he knew that victory was next to impossible and had instead decided to go down fighting, taking as much of the enemy with him as he could. The forces lined up, Antony's infantry on the high ground, cavalry on the flanks, and the navy hugging the coast. Just before the battle was to commence, however, all of Antony's cavalry defected to Octavian, leaving Antony with just his infantry.
Oh, dang, that sucks. Man, it's kind of, like I said, I feel kind of sad for Antony seeing this, like, how far he's fallen, just how he's kind of being pushed around by everyone. It's really kind of almost sad to watch right now, I'm not gonna lie. But yeah, also, like, yeah, I don't blame these guys for defecting. I'm like, why? Like, Antony, this is like suicidal to just fight at this point, right? But man.
Still determined though, Antony ordered the navy to engage Octavian's ships, while he and his infantry fought against Octavian's legions. As the ships drew close, however, they too deserted Antony, raising their oars in salutation to the opposition. Antony and his infantry were quickly defeated and forced to retreat back into the city. Antony had been deserted yet again and denied the glorious end that he had probably been seeking.
Wow.
Upon hearing of the defeat, Cleopatra barricaded herself within her own mausoleum with the treasure of Egypt and a handful of attendants. Messengers were also sent to Antony informing him that Cleopatra was dead. Precisely who sent these messengers and why is unclear. Perhaps there had been a genuine error, with people assuming that Cleopatra had already killed herself. Or perhaps Cleopatra had sent the messengers personally, possibly hoping that Antony would kill himself after hearing the news. Whichever the case, Antony believed the message. He ordered his slave to kill him, but the slave refused, killing himself instead. Antony took up his sword and stabbed himself in the abdomen, but the wound did not kill him. Badly wounded, Antony appealed to those around him to finish him off, but they fled the scene, the last in a string of betrayals and desertions.
Man, just everyone is just like, no, we're not gonna listen to you anymore. He's just lost it all.
His cries of pain were heard throughout the palace, until Diomedes, Cleopatra's secretary, arrived with orders to bring Antony to Cleopatra. Antony was shocked at the news that his queen still lived and was carried to her mausoleum. With Cleopatra unwilling to open the gates, Antony was instead hoisted up and inside the as of yet unfinished building by pulleys. Cleopatra was apparently devastated when she saw him, tearing her clothes, scratching her face and breasts, and smearing her face with his blood. Antony comforted her as best he could and died in her arms.
Dang, that's tragic. Like, yeah, man, their romance is very tragic. You know, like, really plays into the whole very Shakespearean Greek theater, you know, like it really lends itself well to adaptation, these two.
For Octavian, things were now incredibly delicate. Cleopatra was at her most vulnerable, and yet he needed to get access to her and
I need your money
before she could kill herself or destroy all the
This
wealth.
entire point is just him trying to get money now. That's literally all he's trying to do. He's like, I need your money to save myself. Like, give me it all, please.
As such, he first sent a subordinate that Antony had been close with, Procholaus, to negotiate with her. Cleopatra was clearly on her guard though, and rebuffed him. Procholaus then requested the help of Gallus, who approached the gate of the mausoleum and once again engaged Cleopatra in negotiations. Whilst he did, Procholaus took a ladder and snuck into the mausoleum with a couple of servants. They were spotted by one of Cleopatra's attendants, who shouted a warning to her, Cleopatra taking up a dagger to kill herself, before being restrained by Procholaus.
Wow.
The queen and treasure of Egypt were now all in Octavian's hands.
Master play. Yeah, there's only a handful of attendants. Oh, she didn't really have a huge fortification, I suppose. So yeah, that makes sense. They could just easily do that. Wow. Also, I forgot to say rip Antony. Like, we went through a journey with Antony, you know, all his ups and downs, but, you know, a very interesting figure of Roman history and, like, one of the most essential to the end of the Republic, so yeah, you have to give it to him, man. He lasted long, like, you know. I know some people want to just portray him simply as an idiot, and he obviously had his errors and his faults, but, you know, still he made it that long, and that's impressive, so, yeah, overall, a very interesting yet tragic figure in life.
Cleopatra was effectively kept under house arrest in the mausoleum. She was also under suicide watch, with Octavian being careful to make sure she was eating and drinking properly. After about a week of confinement, Octavian met her in person, probably for the first time. What happened in this meeting is largely unknown.
Heck yeah, my emperor has arrived. He basically is the emperor at this point. Like, at this point, no one can challenge him, right?
Cassius Dio says that Cleopatra tried to seduce Octavian with portraits of Julius Caesar on clear display to try and win him over. Plutarch, on the other hand, writes that Cleopatra tried to appeal to Octavian's pity, laying still in mourning with her self-inflicted injuries clear to see. Given what the ancient writers claim about the cunning nature of Cleopatra, either scenario is plausible. Octavian left the meeting, assured that Cleopatra was intent on surviving the war, and would thus form a part of his triumph in Rome. This, however, had been precisely what Cleopatra intended. With his guard lowered, Cleopatra was able to smuggle in the means to kill herself. Precisely what this was is again unknown,
the snake bite,
with Plutarch and Cassius Dio both saying that no one can know for certain. Multiple early sources do, however, claim that she used venomous snakes to kill herself, smuggled in water jars or in a basket of figs. At the same time though, the sources are explicit that no wounds were found on Cleopatra, which in turn suggests she may have ingested poison. In either case, she had sent a final message to Octavian, requesting to be buried alongside Antony. Immediately, Octavian sent men to stop her, but by the time they burst into the room, Cleopatra already lay dead along with her attendants, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty.
Wow. And yeah, that's kind of the end of, like, Alexander's the Great's successors, right? Like, the Ptolemaic dynasty was the last of Alexander's successor, you know, kingdoms. So that's like a big blow, you know? in one hand, the end of this, you know, dynasty that extends back to Alexander the Great, and also the end of the Republic and rise of the Empire. So just overall, just so much happened that it would change the world forever in just like this era. That's amazing.
The deaths of Antony and Cleopatra marked the end of the final civil war of the Roman Republic. The two hold a confusing and often contentious place in history. Antony in particular is often maligned as a drunk, incompetent and foolish, a damning assessment that does not quite stand up to scrutiny. As a soldier, he was a brilliant leader of men, demonstrating courage and clear thinking in disastrous situations, such as the retreat in the Atropatene campaign. As a military strategist, he was not comparable to a man like Caesar, but he was certainly talented and competent. The fact that he was one of Julius Caesar's most trusted captains is proof enough of that. He was also an excellent politician. It is easy to forget that when the war broke out, hundreds of equites and senators, including consuls, sided with Antony, not Octavian. Moreover, Antony was able to hold together the East and its myriad petty kings and leverage all the resources of the East against Octavian. His adoption of Hellenic and Eastern customs was used against him, supposedly showing him as being decadent, but in reality, it shows he was a cunning man who knew how to act the role expected of him. Even Cassius Dio, largely hostile to Antony, credits him as one of the greatest Romans of his day. He was of course a flawed man. He was a better military subordinate than the supreme commander, and though he could be creative and adaptable on the battlefield, his grasp over grander strategy was less strong, as shown by the Actium campaign. He arguably also allowed his love for Cleopatra to cloud his judgment on occasion. It must be recognized, however, that Antony has been the victim of some of the greatest propagandists in history, first Cicero, then Octavian, and centuries later, Shakespeare, and so much of his true character may now be lost to time. Similarly, it is also important to note that Antony had the misfortune of going up against Octavian, arguably the finest politician Rome produced, and Agrippa, one of Rome's most talented generals.
Yeah, the dynamic duo, the best on both fronts, the best politician, the best military commander. Man, Antony really fought a really uphill battle, unfortunately, both in his place in history and at his time. You know, so there's just so much. That's why I said I don't view him as just an idiot, you know, as some people would, as incompetent, and even as brutish, like, you know, as some portrayals make him out to be. Like, he obviously had his faults, but I also think his better qualities are usually ignored for said faults.
No one should be judged too harshly for losing to such titans, and against lesser opponents, Antony may well have been victorious. Cleopatra's reputation tends to swing violently from being viewed as cowardly, manipulative, and a conniving person to a nigh infallible political mastermind. The reality, as is so often the case, is likely somewhere in the middle. By all accounts, Cleopatra was a cunning politician who used her position as Queen of Egypt to make her one of the most powerful individuals of her time. As queen, she was well liked by her people, and managed to become one of the most successful Ptolemaic rulers. She was intelligent and creative, arguably outplaying Octavian in her final moments, deciding the nature of her own death. Ultimately, she was bested by Octavian, but once again there is little shame in losing to such an opponent. Undeniably though, her power derived largely from her relationships with men like Caesar and Antony, using her charm, wit, and sex to draw such individuals to her and enjoy the benefits of their status. While such actions could be described as manipulative, it also needs to be recognized that such methods were one of the few ways that women in the ancient world could wield power.
Yeah, she used all her advantages. There's a good video by overly sarcastic productions about Cleopatra that overall gave me a much more positive impression of her. Like, I think I have like I said, a pretty positive impression of Cleopatra as someone who I really do think cared about her people and was overall, if not being dragged into all of this greater conflict, would have been remembered as a really great ruler for, you know, Ptolemaic Egypt. So, Yeah, unfortunately, she got dragged into these things, into the greater scope of an expanding Rome and the ambitions of, Caesars and whatnot. Though she obviously used it to her advantage, eventually she got dragged into the wrong side with Mark Antony. Um, and that kind of just led to her downfall, right?
It could also be argued that while Antony was the source of much of her power, he was ultimately a poisoned chalice, and Cleopatra made an ultimately disastrous decision in tying herself too closely to him. It also needs to be recognized, though, that, as with Antony, the ancient sources were largely biased against Cleopatra, resulting in many unanswerable questions surrounding her and her true nature potentially being lost to time. What can be said for certain is that Cleopatra inherited a relatively weak position as a queen of a heavily indebted and divided Egypt, and managed to leverage her position to become a major player in world affairs, an impressive feat by itself. The deaths of Antony and Cleopatra left Octavian as the indisputably most powerful man in Rome, and in all probability the world. The huge amount of treasure taken from Egypt allowed him to pay off all the debts he had accumulated throughout the war, and made him rich beyond measure. 14 years after the assassination of Caesar, the cycle of civil wars that it had begun was finally over. It was a turning point in the life of Octavian. For the last decade and a half, he had been ruthless in his pursuit of power, leaving death and destruction in his wake. Now, having outplayed all his rivals, he could afford to be magnanimous and generous in victory. He could be Augustus.
Yes, the Emperor!
We will conclude the series on the last civil war of the Roman Republic and how Octavian transformed it into an empire in the coming months, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member
I just realized the series ain't done yet, guys. There's still one more. I was looking when he was ending that. So apparently there's a part that isn't an individual video, but is a part of the overall series. It's how Rome became an empire. So I guess this is technically a double reaction. This is going to be a bit longer, but you know what? It's the final. Let's just enjoy it, guys. So how Rome became an empire, we kind of covered, the fall of Antony and Cleopatra here. So now let's just see Augustus and his rise and the cementation of the Roman Empire.
Major threat to Octavian's power remains. One major threat to Octavian and generous in victory. He could be Augustus. Though Antony and Cleopatra were dead, one major threat to Octavian's power remained: Caesarion. Though Julius Caesar had never officially recognized the child as his own, he had allowed the boy to be named after him. Many did believe in his fatherhood, and Antony had publicly endorsed it. In all likelihood, these rumors were indeed true.
Yeah, so this is where Augustus is gonna have to kill the kid. Or, is he even a kid at this point? Like, it's been a while, but, I don't remember. I guess he's a child, yeah, but very young. I don't think a full-grown man. I don't know. Point is, yeah, he has to kill him, right? There can only be one Caesar.
Meaning that Octavian was the adopted half-brother of Caesarion, giving Caesarion a possible claim to the now deified Julius Caesar's legacy. Moreover, though he was only 17, Antony had already proclaimed Caesarion the Pharaoh of Egypt, and Cleopatra had him enrolled as part of the army. These proclamations had been intended to establish him as a
Sorry, some technical difficulties.
These proclamations had been intended to establish him as a powerful ruler in his own right, but they instead painted a target on his back. Octavian could suffer no rivals, certainly not one who could challenge his position as Caesar's heir. In the words of Octavian's advisor, Didymus, "Too many Caesars is not good." The boy would need to die. Cleopatra had already seen this coming, and before Octavian's forces reached Alexandria, she sent her son down the Nile, with the likely aim being that he would eventually find refuge at the courts of allied kings in India. Precisely what happened next is not entirely clear. Dio simply says that Octavian's agents were able to catch up to him and capture him on the road. Plutarch gives a more tragic account. In his version, Caesarion is betrayed by his tutor, who lures him back to Alexandria under the pretext of Octavian, who would keep him as a puppet ruler. Naively, the boy returned to the city and was immediately seized. Around the same time, his stepbrother, the 18-year-old Antulus, the son of Antony and Fulvia, was also taken. He too had been betrayed by his tutor and had taken refuge in the Temple of the Divine Julius Caesar in Alexandria, begging for mercy before being dragged out by Octavian's men. Both Antulus and Caesarion were executed on the same day, just weeks after the deaths of their parents. This left the 3 children of Antony and Cleopatra, the 11-year-old twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the infant Ptolemy Philadelphus. Caesarion and Antulus, though young by modern standards, were men in the Roman world, and had both held positions of political and military authority. These 3, however, were helpless, and Octavian knew well that publicly executing children would do little to endear him to the populace. They were, for now, spared. Octavian extended this same mercy to the inhabitants of Alexandria and Egypt, sparing them. Many minor kings and princes of the east had been captured along with the city, and Octavian used them as leverage to rearrange some of the kingdoms in the east to his liking. While in Alexandria, Octavian also toured the city, including visiting the tomb of Alexander the Great. When 33-year-old Caesar saw a statue of Alexander, he is said to have broken down in tears at the thought that, by his age, Alexander was the most powerful and famous man of his age, while Caesar himself was yet to achieve anything. One cannot help but wonder what Octavian, himself the same age as Alexander was when he died, thought to himself when he considered his own achievements. In any case...
Yeah, probably thought he achieved a bit more, right? Because he... I'm not sure what Augustus may have thought, but in a weird way he did, at least because he established an empire that would go on to influence so much of the world. Alexander's unfortunately kind of splintered, and though influential, it was not complete the way he left it, you know? So, yeah, it's kind of hard to say, huh?
Octavian supposedly had eyes only for Alexander, as when the Alexandrians offered to show Octavian the tombs of the Ptolemies, he declined, saying, "I came to see a king, not corpses." The economic power of Egypt was such that Octavian was easily able to take vast amounts of wealth, enough to pay all his soldiers, debts, and more. This power also presented a problem though. Egypt was now an official province of Rome, which would mean that it would need a governor appointed by the Senate to rule over it. This would easily be the most wealthy province at that time, so whoever governed it would have huge amounts of power, enough to potentially threaten Octavian's position. His solution was simple. Rather than being managed by a senator, Egypt would instead be governed by an equites, picked by Octavian personally, and who would thus be subservient to him. Effectively, Octavian would rule the province by proxy. This annexation of Egypt also marked a turning point in history. The Mediterranean had been the fighting ground for many great empires over the centuries, but now the entirety of the sea was enclosed by a single empire. The Romans would now start to refer to it simply as Mare Nostrum, our sea. Having settled affairs in Egypt and made a short tour of the east, Octavian began his journey back to Rome, returning there in early 29 BC. News of his victory and the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra had of course already reached the city, and the Senate had wasted no time proclaiming their loyalty to Octavian in as clear terms as they could. Hundreds of senators, including consuls, had flocked to Antony's side at the start of the war. Now they voted for any honours for him to be revoked, memorials destroyed, and his birthday declared a cursed and unlucky day. Simultaneously, they voted endless honours for Octavian, including celebrations on the anniversary of Actium every 4 years, and making his birthday a public celebration. Octavian accepted many of these, though he was always careful to refuse those that were too egregious. Indeed, some of these suggestions were so outrageously extravagant that it seems likely that Octavian had agents deliberately suggest them in order for him to refuse them graciously, such as the suggestion that the entire populace of Rome should welcome him whenever he entered the city. If this were indeed the case, then it would certainly have been a tactic that Caesar, with his famous refusal of the crown, would have approved of.
Yeah,
Most
certainly.
important among these initial honours were 3 triumphs awarded to Octavian, one for Dalmatia, one for Actium, and one for Alexandria, to be held back-to-back across 3 consecutive days. Octavian, masterfully propagandistic as always, was careful not to portray any of these as victories over other Romans, instead making Cleopatra and the Egyptians the focal point of the last 2 triumphs. During the Alexandrian triumph, an effigy of Cleopatra on her deathbed was paraded. Her youngest child, Ptolemy, does not seem to have survived the journey to Rome, but Alexander and Cleopatra had, and were made to march behind the effigy of their mother, dressed up as the sun god Helios and the moon god Selene, respectively. It was customary for the senators and consuls to meet the triumphant general outside of the city, and then lead him into the city. On these occasions, though, it was Octavian who walked ahead of all the senators and magistrates. It was a clear indicator of the new status quo, with Octavian as the first among equals. After the triumphs, huge games were held, and hippos and rhinos were displayed in Rome for the first time. Furthermore, the doors of Janus, ceremoniously kept open during times of war, were also closed to mark this new period of peace. Rome was in fact still engaged in wars with frontier tribes and kingdoms, but Octavian was not one to let such an unimportant detail as the truth get in the way of a prime moment of propaganda.
Yeah, you gotta do the propaganda, bro. Like, don't forget the truth. Forget history. Let's just spin our own narrative.
Octavian was also hugely generous with his newly amassed fortune. 400 sesterces, roughly a half-year wage for a legionary, was given to 250,000 citizens, and an entire year's wage to 120,000 veterans. The civil wars resulted in a huge number of legions being raised across the Roman world, and by 29 BC there were as many as 60. Octavian had just over half of these disbanded, cutting the total number down to 27, and purchasing vast amounts of land to settle the demobilized soldiers, taking care to make sure they were widely spread out to prevent any one area becoming too powerful thanks to the number of veterans present. In addition to trimming the legions, Octavian also trimmed the Senate, which had swelled in numbers over the years. 200 were either expelled or pressured to leave. Any remaining senators were men who effectively owed their position to Octavian. In 28 BC, Octavian took the consulship for the 6th time, along with Agrippa. It would prove to be an important year in Octavian's career, as he began to distance himself from the ruthless young man with divine ties that he had been for so long.
Yeah, now he dropped the whole viciousness that Octavian embodied and embraced the father of the nation, the lovable and, gracious Augustus, right? A complete image change, which I guess has baffled people, right? Like being like, so what was he? Like this vicious tyrant or this beloved emperor who's so, gracious and kind? And I think a bit of both. I don't know how much of a persona he put on. I don't know for certain, but either way, yeah, there is a clear change from the two identities, right?
Instead, crafting an image of a humble, generous, and unassuming statesman. He ordered silver statues that had been made in his likeness melted down, and took a particular interest in restoring and refurbishing 82 temples throughout the city. The great temple that Agrippa had been sponsoring, which was originally intended to be dedicated to Octavian, was changed to be dedicated to all the gods instead, and its rebuilt version survives today as the Pantheon. Octavian tied himself even closer to Agrippa by having his niece marry him, thus making the two men related by marriage. Together, they embarked on a popularity campaign of sorts, quadrupling the grain allowance and giving magnificent gifts to many senators. They were so generous that, combined with their earlier gifts of money to hundreds of thousands of people, they inadvertently caused significant inflation. Nonetheless, their popularity soared, and this same year, Octavian was voted the honorific title of Princeps Senatus, the first senator. This had been a traditional role within the Republic for centuries, but had lost much of its significance after Sulla's reign. Octavian effectively revived the traditional office and gave it a new meaning, more akin to first citizen rather than just the first senator. Most notably, during this year, Octavian and Agrippa announced that the national emergency that had been declared in 43 BC was now over, and the laws and rights of citizens were restored. It was a precursor for what was to follow. On the 1st of January 27 BC, Octavian entered the Senate to make one of the most important speeches in human history. He began by highlighting how powerful he was. He had all the money, the loyalty of all the legions, more power and influence than any man had ever had in Roman history. It would, he pointed out, be so easy for him to use just a fraction of those resources and seize power on his own in its entirety.
Imagine they just all jump him right there and just start stabbing him. No, I'm joking, I'm assuming this is where he, like, offers to, like, you know, drop it all, be humble, and, you know, go away. I've done my work, guys. I'm giving it all back to the people, you know?
He claimed, never wanted any of this power, but circumstances demanded he take up the mantle, and he did what was needed for the good of Rome. But now he had avenged Caesar and restored order. Octavian had achieved what he set out to do, and so he addressed the Senate as follows. The gods as my witness, I who have so many brave soldiers and devoted allies, who hold supreme power within the pillars of Hercules, who possess cities and provinces in every continent, at a time when there are no enemies abroad or at home, when you are all at peace, are strong and united and would yield to me, I, despite all of this, voluntarily and by my own design, resign so great a dominion and give up these vast possessions.
Yeah, the show of humility, right? What a humble man.
The most powerful man in the world would willingly give all his power back to the Senate and the people, and retire as a private citizen. It was masterfully done. Some in the Senate knew Octavian's cunning, and knew what he was truly doing, but there were many who truly believed him. Out of these, some were genuinely disappointed, as they really did think that Rome needed one man at their head to govern them. The ones who thought a return to a true republic was best were just as nervous. After all, even as a private citizen, Octavian would still have the entirety of the Senate in his pocket, and would be outside the political establishment. Octavian had effectively checkmated them all. Whether motivated by
genius, greatest politician of all time, in my opinion, but definitely up there, you know, like, dang. And now they're gonna be begging him, no, stay forever! It's like, alright, I will. Also, all my power is going to my successor. Not a kingdom, just, you know, just being first citizen. Yeah, the empire before Diocletian was kind of known to have the pretext of not being an empire in a sense, like, just, they didn't use the term emperor, I don't think, at least not right away, so there's a pretext that, you know, the Senate was still, I kind of like when Diocletian showed up. I think it was Diocletian, the reformer. He's like, yeah, no, the rule of one, like, let's just acknowledge the truth. I'm, you know, the ruler, right? I don't know.
Fear, greed, resignation, or genuine support, there was only one course of action to take. In short order, the Senate unanimously implored Octavian not to retire and take power for himself. Graciously, Octavian refused, but the appeals kept coming until eventually—
I love this. No, I couldn't, please. Me, the most powerful man in the world? Guys, I can't do it. I can't do it, guys, please. And they're just like, please, we're begging you to be our emperor, essentially. It's like, fine, if I have to, if I must. I can just imagine the freaking drama that he's putting on right now. I wish I could have been there just to witness it.
Actually, Octavian gave in and allowed himself to be forced back into government. The powers given to him in this first settlement, as it was now called, were extraordinary. Octavian would now, by law, be appointed to one of the consulships yearly. He was also given a 10-year governorship of an extended province that constituted the entirety of Hispania, Gaul, Cilicia, and Syria. Egypt would remain a special province governed by an equites appointed by Octavian. It was no coincidence that these provinces also contained the majority of the legions, giving Octavian direct control of 20 while the Senate had just 6. He was also to be awarded a new title. Octavian had initially considered taking the name Romulus to show himself as the founder of a new Rome, but upon deliberation he thought that this was too unsubtle. Instead, he would take a more unique title, Augustus. Meaning revered one. The ruthless Octavian had forged the path to power, but now it would be the merciful and magnanimous Augustus who would wield it.
I've said it before, but Augustus is my favorite Roman emperor. Probably my favorite historical figure, because when I was in 5th grade, I chose him specifically to give a report, right? We had to write like a report about a famous historical figure. I don't know how I came to learn about him, but I chose him, I remember back then. And fast forward to when I was a sophomore in high school, I had to give a presentation on a historical figure in history class. I chose Augustus again. And, I've just, I think in my opinion, he's the best politician to probably ever live. I think he is the best Roman emperor. I know very takes that not a lot of people might agree with me, but that's just how I feel. That's my opinion. And just nothing but I can't help but admire the genius of this man. He has an empire. Obviously, he's not calling it an empire. He's not even treating it like it, but it really is. It's just the genius of this man is just amazing, and what he set into motion is just with the empire and the history that spans all the way till the fall of Constantinople by the Ottomans, I believe. So it's just this empire that changed the world and that we still take from today in Western society. It's just, I'm at awe of Augustus,
From an outside perspective, it may have seemed that Augustus, as he would now always be known, had indeed largely restored the Republic. The Senate still appointed magistrates as they always had been doing, laws were proposed and passed in the traditional way, and though Augustus's powers were quite extraordinary, they had been legally assigned. In practice, though, Augustus ruled almost the entirety of the Republic. His power at the moment rested upon 3 pillars. The first was his position as consul, which allowed him to speak in the Senate, propose bills, and granted him legitimacy. The second was his powers as governor, which by extension meant control of the majority of Rome's legions, always giving him the subtle threat of military force if necessary. The last, and probably the most important pillar of power, was his network. This power was unofficial and nebulous, but it effectively consisted of all the gifts, political favors, patronage, and appointments that Augustus had made, which put anyone in any position of power in his debt. The Romans called this auctoritas, a combination of prestige and influence. In many ways, one could think of the Rome of this era as a shadow puppet. It looked and acted like a republic, but it was Augustus who controlled the strings. The Republic was for all intents and purposes dead. The only real vestiges of senatorial power left were in the provinces Augustus had allowed them to govern, and in some of the more senior magistrate positions, such as the other consul. Even these, however, would eventually be stamped out. In 24 BC, Marcus Primus, the governor of Macedonia, a senatorial province, declared war on a neighbouring Thracian kingdom without Senate approval. The Senate put him on trial to answer for his action, and Primus defended himself by saying that Augustus had ordered the attack. This was dangerous. Augustus had no legal authority over a senatorial province, and the accusation threatened to shatter the facade and show Augustus as the sole ruler of Rome. Augustus flatly denied the charges, and Primus was found guilty of treason. Shortly after, the men who had led the trial were implicated in a mysterious conspiracy against Augustus and put to death. The whole affair had shown that while Augustus's powers were enormous, they were not quite universal. This would not do. Thus, in 23 BC, a second settlement was made between Augustus and the Senate. In this settlement, Augustus streamlined his powers and made them more universal. His powers as governor were expanded and made more flexible. He still retained power over the original provinces assigned to him, but he was also given authority over all other governors. Though men appointed by the Senate would still govern senatorial provinces, these governors would now be junior to Augustus, who could intervene in any province if he so desired. Traditionally, the powers of governors ended as soon as they crossed the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome. This was no longer the case for Augustus, and his powers as governor were extended to exist within the city as well. Lastly, he was given tribunal powers for life. The office of Tribune of the Plebs was, in the traditional functioning of the Republic, a rather junior one, but it held the important power of being able to propose legislation as well as the ability to veto any laws. Augustus now completely controlled the Roman world. His extended and extraordinary governorship gave him power throughout all the provinces, and his tribunal powers allowed him to dictate politics in Rome in any way he saw fit. As a result, Augustus willingly resigned the consulship and never held it again, aside from on a couple of ceremonial occasions. It was no longer needed. The office of the consul, which had been the most important office in Rome for centuries, was now almost entirely powerless, entirely eclipsed by Augustus's powers. Though he never took any monarchical title, he was now in every sense the Emperor of Rome.
Yes.
In 49 BC, Caesar's civil war had begun. Caesar's power over 3 provinces and command of 10 legions had been considered far too dangerous by the Senate of the time, who had
now this dude's in charge of everything. Perfectly fine.
demanded he relinquish his powers. After 5 years of civil war, Caesar emerged with even more power, and as a result was assassinated by the Senate in 44 BC. It had been an ironic twist that the attack had happened in the theatre of Pompey, Caesar dying at the base of a statue of his great rival. Now, 20 years later, the Senate gathered for every meeting in the Curia Julia, built by and named for Julius Caesar. In that building, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus presided as the most powerful man in the Roman world, with control over every province and 27 legions. Augustus had played the game perfectly. Whereas Caesar had arguably been too merciful and spared too many enemies, Octavian had been absolutely brutal in his pursuit of power and ordered the deaths of hundreds, including innocents. He had contended with some of the most illustrious figures of the ancient world, including the likes of Brutus, Cassius, Cicero, Sextus, Lepidus, Cleopatra, and Antony, and emerged triumphant. As Augustus, there were now none that could threaten him. Powers beyond imagining had been voluntarily and legally given to him, powers that put even those of Caesar to shame. And yet,
Honestly.
Augustus was hailed as one of the greatest Romans in history. For centuries after his death, people would pray that new emperors would be as blessed and fortunate as Augustus. Memories of what he had done to gain power faded, and Augustus's reputation became one of humility, piety, and wisdom, a reputation that he still holds today. His life was a masterclass in politics, and without a doubt he was one of the most talented, cunning, and clever statesmen in human history. When Augustus had begun his career, the Republic was broken. With his assistance, it became the bloody and tyrannical Second Triumvirate. Now, under his guidance, Rome had become something else again. The Roman Empire had begun. The next season of this series will talk about what Augustus did for the rest of his career, and how his extended dynasty, called Julio-Claudian by historians, ruled after him. If you don't want to miss that and many other historical videos, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button.
Dang. So yeah, I finished this series really quick. At the time, he hasn't made these Julio-Claudian videos. I'm dumping this costume, by the way. At this point, if I had to wear it every Roman video, I'm done. But, I binged this, at the time of this recording, it is May 24th, I binge this. By the time this video comes out, it will be the end of the year. So overall, I have covered it. And by the time it comes out, no doubt more will be done. But this is basically the end of the Caesar series by, you know, Kings and Generals. And quite frankly, you know, a masterpiece. Just amazing. So, I guess the word I would look for is beautiful. One of the greatest series on YouTube. I loved every minute of it. It is just a masterclass of historical representation. I think him and Epic History TV are second to none in terms of presenting history. And, this was just awesome. Like I said, I knew a bit about Caesar, knew a good amount of Augustus, but here I feel like I've come out so much more educated and enlightened about the fall of the Republic and just this epic era of human history. And I loved it, guys. It was amazing. It was beautiful. Just learning about the insane exploits of Caesar, you know, the complicated civil wars, the politics of the triumvirates, the fall, just everything. It hit everything, and it did it beautifully and great. And Kings and Generals, you have nothing but my praise. I love this series. I loved what you did. This was awesome. And I can't wait for more about Rome. Hopefully, I'm just hoping that when you do make about the Julia Claudia, I hope you just make Livia a murderer and she just killed all of Augustus's heirs. No, I'm joking. But I'll be there to see it. So guys, this is the end of, for now, you know, the end of the Caesar series, the Rise of Caesar, as I think I would call it, the Rise of the Caesars. And yeah, overall great, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Bye, everyone.